Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Merry Christmas to you. From my heart to yours, from our team to your family. Here's a special of the best of Judging Freedom during 2023 that our team has put together for you. I hope you like it.
Take a look at his opponents. I mean, you have like Benny Gantz. This guy led the wars against Gaza from 2009 to 2014. Thousands and thousands of civilians. It set the stage for the current assault. And Netanyahu is being criticized because he has always avoided long wars and preferred the strategy of mowing the lawn, which is itself really sick and twisted if you think about it, right. Which is just going in for a week or two, killing a few mid-level commanders, doing some damage to civilian infrastructure and saying, hey, we mowed the lawn, now let's manage the occupation. So I'm worried about
you're saying a pox on both their houses. There is no real governmental opposition. There's opposition in the public, but there's no real governmental opposition to the type of ethnic cleansing that Netanyahu is participating in.
No, there's no peace camp in Israel. I mean, you have 1.8% of the Israeli public answering a recent poll saying that Israel's using too much firepower in the Gaza Strip. The person who presided over the Oslo Accords, which is supposedly the peace plan, Yitzhak Rabin, he was the author of the original act of systematic ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. He presided over the so-called Lida Ramle Death March during the 1948 war, in which 150,000 Palestinians were sent marching at the point of a gun after several massacres in the towns of Lida and Ramle towards the east. And they all live in Ramallah and refugee camps in the West Bank now. His final speech, he said, I'm not going to give the Palestinians a state. This was a speech to the Knesset. I will give them less than a state. And that's been the plan from the point of view of the Labor Party. Netanyahu has just lifted the mask on all that in the same way that Donald Trump sort of lifted the mask on U.S. empire. And that's why Netanyahu is seen as a threat to this whole system that the U.S. had in place. This whole war that we're seeing right now is ripping the entire mask off the entire program of occupation management. And by design, that was Hamas's plan. Hamas doesn't want to govern anymore. They're done. And what they want to see happen is for the Palestinian Authority to be so discredited that it too dissolves and that Israel is forced to govern the Gaza Strip and the West Bank as it had been before. And they finally have an honest occupation, and that will force the hand of the US and EU, because they can no longer say, oh, well, the Palestinians have their sovereignty and, they're getting their work permits. It's their fault for walking away from the negotiating table, but they got that. And that's what we're going to see take place.
Did the IDF recently stage a fake prisoner surrender with Palestinian civilians, or 85% Palestinian civilian males in their underwear?
Yeah, I shouldn't be laughing because this was a calamitous war crime. I mean, they shoved it in our faces. When I first saw these photos, I thought, are they real? And then I realized the Israelis released them. And then I realized that they're doing it to project an image of victory, because they have no clear battlefield victory to present back to their public, which is still traumatized and humiliated by October 7th. So they took a bunch of guys from UN schools where they were sheltering with their families. They threatened and beat their wives and kids and sent them away. And then they stripped these guys who are bakers, electricians, just regular guys, paraded them on the street. And then at one point in a staged scene, forced a man who runs an aluminum shop in northern Gaza to hand over a gun that they handed to him. And then they told the Israeli public, we have destroyed the Hamas Jabalia division and they have all surrendered en masse. We won.
Given the short attention span Americans have, and given their priority on Israel and Hamas, is what Secretary Blinken said truthful and realistic?
The first part that I think is absolutely true is NATO, to my surprise at the very beginning, have been steadfast in supporting Ukraine. Why? They actually understand Russian aggression in Europe, and they do not want Putin to expand his span of control. So I think the Europeans are in for a long haul. What I worry about is our own domestic political situation.
Right.
I mean, there's elements in Congress, and someone pointed this out to me the other day. You know, I'm a Cold Warrior. I've been around a long time. I've seen this act before, whole generation, but there's so many young people, anyone under 50, right, probably has no idea what the Cold War was about. They're not even sure about what World War II is or where Ukraine is. It's just another country. So I think there is this growing divide about why are we in Ukraine, and the longer it goes on. However, this is Jack's best call, and your folks will love this because it relates to the deep state. And so in Washington,
my folks are your folks. Go ahead.
You have, let me include myself in there. Let's save the mystery from everybody. So my point is, there are people that are professionally in foreign policy in both parties and think tanks that, you know, work these problems. This is how they live. This is what they love. And I think in that, and when you look at Congress, it's reflected in there that there's a large segment of that group that understand the problem, so that I think the congressional support will remain there. It's unfortunate that the way it looks now, it allows Putin to think that there's more hope than he thinks there is. He's also hoping Donald Trump wins the election, and somehow that cuts another deal. I want to announce early, if should that happen, Donald Trump is elected, I still believe our policy will be very strong on Ukraine. Now, his partners may disagree. So I'm not even expecting it, but Putin believes that. I believe he believes that. He believes we're weak and that we'll get wobbly knees. And it's the reason I write a couple of the op-eds saying, don't get wobbly knees. This is bigger than Russia and Ukraine.
Switching gears to the other hotspot, which is, of course, Israel and Hamas. The New York Times reported last night that Israeli intelligence had compiled a 40-page report showing the preparation for the October 7th invasion, showing the likely 60 places where Hamas would breach the security wall between Israel and Gaza. And it turned out they were the same 60 that were breached. And they had this report a year ago, and the Netanyahu administration did not take it seriously. At the same time, you can roll all this in, Jack.
But I would just say, I think the New York Times article sounds credible to me. That's such a, I think, but it sounds to me like a single report. In other words, here's the plan. And when they received the plan, they didn't have a time frame for it. And their own assessment was they don't have the capability to do this. Okay.
Well, that was an erroneous assessment.
It isn't. Let me just bear with me 1 second, because I've been in this thing a dozen times where government officials present a paper, go away, a crisis comes, they dig through the archives, find it, and say, see, we told you.
I want to play a clip for you of FBI Director Chris Wray giving some recent testimony in Congress. To me, particularly the second half of this clip, sounds like he was reading from the playbook of Lindsey Graham or Nikki Haley about Iran. Take a listen.
The reality is that the terrorism threat has been elevated throughout 2023, but the ongoing war in the Middle East has raised the threat of an attack against Americans in the United States to a whole nother level. But it's not just Hamas. As the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, the Iranians, for instance, have directly or by hiring criminals mounted assassination attempts against dissidents and high-ranking current and former U.S. government officials, including right here on American soil. For example, the cyber targeting of American interests and critical infrastructure that we already see conducted by Iran and non-state actors alike, we can expect to get worse if the conflict expands, as will the threat of kinetic attacks.
As far as you know, are realistic or a drumbeat?
I think it's a lot of bull. I think that basically the world's biggest sponsor of terrorism is the United States. I think that all of his presumptions about what's going on in the Middle East, Iran has been the target of terrorism by the United States and Israel, with its scientists assassinated, with its officials being killed by the United States, Soleimani in Baghdad, with support for what the Israelis are doing in Syria, where they're bombing airports, even though they're not at war with Syria, and we are providing them cover. I mean, come on, let's get this straight, Mr. Ray. I know you're getting paid by the people that you want to satisfy by saying what they want to hear, but you are so full of it that I can't even come up with the expletive to describe it.
Good for you, Phil. Good for you. Are you surprised that he has weighed in directly like this and that he has said more clearly than anybody that the Palestinian people are entitled to an independent country with all the rights of sovereignty?
A retired general of the Israeli Defense Force several years ago said to me as I was driving with him along the Golan Heights, he said, "You know, Douglas, we should have gone to Madagascar." Now, most of your audience will not understand what that means, but at the time when the Zionist movement was taking off, there were lots of discussions about where should we Jews go. And one of the destinations was Madagascar. There was absolutely no determination early on for any reason that it absolutely desperately needed to be in the Middle East and in Palestine, or what we call Palestine, certainly since the Roman Empire. His point was simple. Look, if we'd gone somewhere else, we probably would have been far happier and far more successful, because we were planted in a region where from the moment we arrived, we were treated as a bacillus, as an infection. Mr. Netanyahu has acknowledged this. He has said publicly, this is a civilizational conflict. He is correct. Israel is not, strictly speaking, a Middle Eastern state. It's an extension of the West. It is a Jewish form of Western civilization, but it is nevertheless an extension of it. It is not part of the Islamic world, and the Islamic world has never accepted it. So the problem I have with what Mr. Xi is saying, not with his ultimate purpose, but he needs to point out that from the moment they arrived, the Jews were unwanted. They were under assault. And so they seized what they have by force. And we, and to a lesser extent, the British, have helped them to stay there and flourish and survive. But 75 years later, the same condition that made them unwelcome is still there. It hasn't changed. But the quality and the capabilities of their adversaries or potential opponents, those things have improved dramatically. And they can no longer play off the various actors against each other, which they've done very successfully for many years. Now, the last point is this. Mr. Xi said something that's very important, and I absolutely agree with the president on this. President Xi said an authoritative conference. In other words, an outcome that can be imposed on the people in the region. That is the way that issues have been settled, certainly in Europe for centuries, and I would argue to some extent in Asia for centuries. In other words, we're not going to tolerate any more squabbling or conflict. This is how it's going to be. The great powers stepped up and imposed it.
If Americans understood the fact that, hey, we aren't pure, there's that great meme around. It's like, maybe we're the baddies here. we aren't the good guys here. We are not the good guys because we have not. And I'm not saying the Russians are good guys either. Don't be saying, "Oh, Tony said they're the good guys." No, I'm going to get in so much trouble this morning. It's so early.
I love when you get like this, and so do the fans. Go ahead, be yourself.
So I'm just saying, it's like nobody is pure here. But I'm saying that Putin has a rational understanding of the grievances they hold, and the American public doesn't understand why they're upset. I think if the American public understood why Putin's upset, it's like, oh, that makes sense, because most Americans understand fairness. And if Americans understood that we, the United States, through a series of Democrat and Republican-led administrations, serially broke rules that we agreed to, I think they'd say, well, why don't you go talk to the guy and figure something out? Right? I mean, that's the rational thing to do.
Right.
So that's what I think Putin's saying here. It's like, yeah, we're ready to talk when they figure out what they're doing.
Bottom line, do we not talk to the Russians? Does Tony Blinken not have the ability or the authority or the intellect or the courage, whatever you want to call it, to pick up the phone and call Foreign Minister Lavrov and say, let's talk?
Yeah, he doesn't. I often make fun of what I call Spanky Banana. You know, that's my nickname for Blinken, because he used to play guitar in college. You know, that was his band, Spanky Banana. So no, I'm just kidding. It's a joke. Don't take it too seriously. Anyway,
I thought we were breaking news here for a minute.
Yeah, no, I said it on the network too, and I get upset. That's okay. Anyway, Blinken should be playing guitar in a band somewhere, because he doesn't have the rationality or fortitude necessary to do the right thing for the right reasons. He's not going to do this. What we're talking about, this is a Reagan move, Judge. You and I have been friends, and I've been mentored by a lot of the Reagan guys. This is a Reagan move.
The reference, of course, is to the Pentagon Papers, now a famous Supreme Court opinion standing for the proposition that if the media possesses something of material interest to the public, it can publish it with civil and criminal immunity. That, of course, does not immunize the person who gave them the documents. Daniel Ellsberg was fortunate that the FBI broke into his psychiatrist's office during the trial and stole records of what the psychiatrist's notes were from the therapy sessions. And the trial judge was so outraged, he dismissed the charges in the middle of a trial for espionage. And Daniel Ellsberg walked out of the courtroom a free man. But he was obviously willing to go to jail to expose the lies in the Vietnam War. Here he is. Very moving.
Do not do what I did. Don't do what I did. Don't wait till the bombs are falling and thousands more have died. Act like Catherine Gunn. Act like as I wish I had done in 1964, when I knew that people were being lied to death. Putting out documents to that effect before the war, right at the time, at whatever cost to oneself, at whatever risk, which is not even comparable to the massacres that were actually ongoing or in process. Do what I wish I had done in 64, not what I waited till 69 and 71. Act like Catherine Gunn and Ed Snowden and Tom Drake, Bill Binney, many others on that list, in particular Ed Snowden and Julian Assange, and act while there are still lives to be saved.
One of his last public statements before he died, basically a call, Matt, to people in government today who can document and demonstrate that the government, let's go to Ukraine, knows we're losing in Ukraine, knows the Ukrainian state has collapsed, knows the money we've sent there, much of it has been stolen, and still wants to send another 68 billion. Matt?
And the willingness to put it all together. And I think most people in the U.S. and certainly around the world, and in the U.S., it's younger folks who seem to be catching on to this and having the courage, if you will, the audacity, if you will, to connect the dots, not allow any blackouts in American history. So you see that what's happening in Ukraine, that looks different. It's a proxy war. It's not a direct war. It's in Europe. It's not in the Middle East. But it's fundamentally no different than what happened in Iraq, fundamentally no different than happened in Afghanistan. Those are no different than what we did in Central America and Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what you need are the people to come out to provide that color, because people have a black and white understanding, and they need their suspicions, their thoughts, their understanding of what's occurring with our government overseas to be confirmed. And I just want to go back to Dan and Ray as well, but Dan referenced Catherine Gunn. And if most Americans are not familiar with Catherine Gunn because she was British, and she was a member of GCHQ, which is the British version of the NSA. And she went to the press in the weeks before the U.S. invasion of Iraq to detail how the U.S. and the British were trying to sabotage the diplomatic process at the United Nations. And a quick and easy way to learn about her, a fantastic movie called Official Secrets with Keira Knightley. It's a great film, tells Catherine's story very well. But that's the type of thing we're talking about. We need the people who have the evidence. Right.
There are a lot of people, you would know this better than I because you used to work there, in the State Department, who have recently indicated enormous public displeasure with the president's policies in Ukraine and Gaza. Am I right about that, Matt?
And we just yesterday, I believe it was, you have 40 interns at the White House sign a letter stating we do not support this. This government, our government, is not just promoting genocide, it's enabling genocide. We're providing the bombs to kill the people who are being ethnically cleansed. And so you're seeing that throughout. You've seen at the State Department, particularly with the high-profile resignation of Josh Paul, who is just absolutely stellar, being, just a moral exemplar right now in a time when we have very few moral exemplars publicly in the government. But then you had the USAID, over 1,000 people at USAID, that's the United States' development arm of the State Department, sign a letter protesting against this. You have 400 political appointees throughout the government sign a letter disagreeing with this support for genocide. And, with that speaking out, with that stepping out, there also comes back to what Ray was talking about, the need for people to put their bodies on the line. And as Dan was saying as well, and Dan Ellsberg got arrested about 100 times at least. So he wasn't just mouthing these words without putting his body behind it. Ray has been arrested many, many times. I keep on my wall right next to me. You'll like this, George. This is Ray's bolo from the State Department when he interrupted Hillary, when he did a silent interruption of Hillary Clinton. And the State Department was so threatened by that. The Secretary of State, the American government, was so threatened by a person standing silently in opposition to Hillary Clinton's warmongering that they put out a bolo, be out on the lookout, be on the lookout for, right? I mean, and so that's the type of people that we need to rally around and support and listen to, because they're the ones who've left before, and they're the ones that we need now.
If Israel is engaged in ethnic cleansing, if it is intentionally slaughtering innocents, these are clearly war crimes. Israel is using American equipment and ammunition, to say nothing of American popular, moral, political, and PR support. Is Joe Biden, is his administration, is the American government complicit in these war crimes?
What the Israelis say is, of course, they're moving these people and persuading them forcibly to go because they're starving, is for humanitarian purposes. But that's entirely bogus. This is ethnic cleansing that is taking place. And as I've tried to explain, this isn't, the war on Hamas is not involved. Hamas, 60 meters beneath the surface, they're not engaged in this at all. They're not killing Hamas. It's not saying we have to do this because, Hamas might pop up and then suddenly kill us. Hamas are not in the hospitals there. They have their own hospital buried underground, which is where they are going. So it is entirely that. And what concerns me is the time is running out for the United States and for the Biden administration, which has tied itself so closely to this operation in Gaza. Time is running out because sentiment in the United States, in Europe, but more around the world is getting impassioned about what they see, because they see it much more clearly in the rest of the world, what's happening, because it's all over their television stations 24 hours.
Joe Biden saying,
Oh God.
we will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Joe Biden saying we will support Ukraine for as long as we can. Joe Biden saying Putin has lost. Joe Biden saying if Putin wins. Watch all this.
On commitments to Ukraine, long-term security to deter future aggression after this war ends is a goal. And we're advancing this goal by providing them the support Ukraine needs now on the battlefield and helping them strengthen their military over the long term. The fact of the matter is that I believe we'll have the funding necessary to support Ukraine as long as it takes. Putin has failed in his effort to subjugate Ukraine. The brave people of Ukraine have defied Putin's will at every turn. Backed by the strong and unwavering support of the United States and our allies and partners of more than 50 nations in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And Ukraine will emerge from this war proud, free, and firmly rooted in the West unless we walk away. The American people can be and should be incredibly proud of the part they played in supporting Ukraine's success. We'll continue to supply Ukraine with critical weapons and equipment as long as we can. Russian loyalists in Moscow celebrated when Republicans voted to block Ukraine aid last week. The host of a NATO. Extreme Republicans are playing chicken with our national security, holding Ukraine's funding hostage to their extreme partisan border policies. If Putin takes Ukraine, he won't stop there. It's important to see the long run here. He's going to keep going. He's made that pretty clear. If Putin attacks a NATO ally, then we'll have something that we don't seek and that we don't have today. American troops fighting Russian troops. American troops fighting Russian troops if he moves into other parts of NATO.
How dangerous to make that threat, but how absurd for him to say, as long as it takes, as long as we can. Putin's already lost. Oh, but if he wins and takes Ukraine, he's going to go into NATO. How discredited is that argument? How ancient is that argument?
Well, I mean, it's just not to focus too much on Biden's character, but this is Joe Biden talking, and we're talking ancient, senile, just completely ridiculous and uncredible Joe Biden talking up there. Everyone who's an honest analyst of this, including some hawks at least, will acknowledge that it didn't have to be this way. That, in fact, the Russians did have legitimate security interests, such as keeping Ukraine out of America's military alliance right on their border.
Right.
And especially in the situation where the Russians had taken Crimea in the aftermath of the American-sponsored coup d'etat and fake revolution, essentially right-wing putsch in the street of 2014. And the Ukrainians, with American support, claimed that no, it still belongs to us. It's still sovereign Ukrainian territory, and hell or high water, we're going to take it back. And Putin said over and over again, now you keep saying you're going to bring Ukraine into NATO while we have a dispute, in the middle of having a dispute over who owns Crimea. That could lead directly to war. And so you're forcing us into this situation. That was right. The idea that, oh, yeah, no, now he's coming next into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and Finland. And then from there, he's going to go to Poland and Germany. And the next thing you know, he's going to be in Paris and Madrid. I mean, this is all just make-believe. You know, they know good and well that they provoked this war. They wanted it to happen. Or at least they thought, plan B is it happens and we don't mind. We see a great strategic advantage in letting it happen, so why not? As Zbigniew Brzezinski said about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, we knowingly increased the probability that they would. How about that for provoked? Get it? That's how they play the game. And so, you know, And honestly, Judge, I don't know how many Nazis are left because a lot of them have been killed in the war. But America has set up and betrayed a bunch of Hitler-loving Nazis over there, promised them the world, and now are delivering them a humiliating defeat. And, you know, if it's their analogy is Afghanistan, and we got Egyptian Islamic Jihad and Al-Qaeda as the result of the war in Afghanistan turned against the United States, what can we expect to happen when they build up these massive Nazi military forces there? And these are not comparable to the Aryan nation in the woods in Alabama somewhere or something. These are real armed, highly trained, and combat experienced militia forces, highly ideological along the lines of the Banderists who fought with the Nazis during World War II.
Here's the principal spokesperson and fundraiser for those Nazis, President Zelenskyy, yesterday. Oh, I'll let you listen to what he has to say about World War II and about how Putin hasn't won. 15.
Defending freedom. For nearly 2 years, we have been in a full-scale war, the biggest since World War II. Fighting for freedom, we stand firm. No matter what Putin tries, he hasn't won any victories. Thanks to Ukraine's success in defense, other European nations are safe from the Russian aggression, unlike in the past.
Now, he's standing next to the President of the United States, who, of course, has been all over the place on how long we'll back you up and has Putin won and if Putin loses and when Putin takes Ukraine. But Zelenskyy is apparently still under the delusion or illusion that he can continue to fight and ultimately triumph in this war.
Well, you know, I don't disdain Zelenskyy as bad as some do. I know he's corrupt, as virtually any politician or connected businessman in that country is.
Intent is obviously where you start, and it's vitally important. And I'm very confident in the intent, but results, of course, are fundamentally what matters.
Does anybody believe this, Larry? The Israeli government agreed to this approach. They resumed the killing before the break of dawn, Israel time.
Yeah, Israel told Blinken what he wanted to hear, and they're going to go ahead and do what they want to do, which is they have no regard about killing civilians now. You know, I used to call them the Israeli Defense Forces. I think they've shamed themselves, dishonored themselves in such a way that I will only refer to them as the Israeli occupation forces going forward. Because there is no excuse or justification to kill civilians like they are. And I saw that Senator Tom Cotton made the ridiculous, absurd observation that, well, we did it in World War II in Dresden, and therefore it's just part of the price of war. It both shows his ignorance of military matters, even though he served, because the fact of the matter is the U.S. bombing of civilian centers during World War II did nothing to hasten the end of the war. Right. Because killing civilians, they're not the ones out there fighting. And it wasn't necessarily that you're killing the workforce either, because the Nazis were enslaving Jews to do that. So this notion that we can tolerate a country like Israel committing what are war crimes, pure and simple. There is no excuse, no justification to kill civilians in this way. But they're not just doing it with bombs. They're shooting unarmed civilians. There's ample videotape of that. So, right, it's sickening and disgusting.
Ray, what Larry says, in my view, and I think in yours, is 100% correct. But Blinken really undercuts any credibility whatsoever that he may have as the Secretary of State for him to say a clear plan is in place that puts a premium on protecting civilians. Nobody believes that. There is zero evidence for that.
Yeah, I agree with what Larry and you are saying. I would go one step farther. The U.S. is not tolerating it. It's enabling it. Without U.S. armed and political support, Israel would stop this genocide.
before this war, I was opposed to membership of Ukraine in NATO because I feared that it would start exactly the process that we are seeing now. Now that this process has reached this level, the idea of a neutral Ukraine under these conditions is no longer meaningful. And at the end of the process that I described, it ought to be guaranteed by NATO in whatever forms NATO can develop. But I believe Ukrainian membership in NATO would be an appropriate outcome.
How could they morally assault southern Gaza after they forced people and encouraged them by all their leaflets to leave northern Gaza and go down there? It's almost like shooting fish in a barrel if they do that. Or is my question absurd because there is no morality here? There are no moral standards.
Well, I wouldn't say your question is absurd, but I think that you gave the answer. You can't make a moral case for this. Look, what the Israelis have done is they basically turned Gaza into a free fire zone. You and I are old enough to remember the Vietnam War. Right. And we would turn certain areas of Vietnam into free fire zones. And anything that moved in those zones was liable or likely to be killed. And in a very important way, that's what the Israelis have been doing in Gaza. They've been going after hospitals. They've been going after ambulances. They've been going after UN institutions. They've been going after schools. And they, of course, justify this because they argue that Hamas fights from those places. Right. Hamas is everywhere. And if you buy that argument, then you can make the case that you should just destroy the whole place. Treat it like a free fire.
Is that the end game? To destroy Gaza and slaughter 2 million human beings?
Well, I don't think they're going to slaughter 2 million human beings. My view is that what the Israelis wanted to do in an ideal world was ethnically cleanse Gaza. And in the very beginning, it looked like they may get away with that because it looked like the United States was playing along. But what's happened since then is that not only the United States, but various Arab countries and the Palestinians themselves have made it unequivocally clear that this is not happening. We're not having a second Nakba. The Palestinians are not going to be cleansed in Gaza. So the question is, what's the fallback position? And there are two things you can do, and this is what I was alluding to before. One is you can punish the civilian population. You can bomb the civilian population and inflict massive punishment on them. And you can go after Hamas and root out Hamas and finish it off. My argument is the Israelis are not going to do the latter. They're not going to go after Hamas in any meaningful way. They're not going to defeat Hamas. And therefore, they're forced to bomb.
Well, what is their goal then if they're not going to defeat Hamas? I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that's their goal. This crazy security minister, Ben-Gvir, has said that that's their goal.
They have no winning goal. That's the problem. The Israelis are in deep trouble, and we're in deep trouble as well. There's no magic formula here. And by the way, we haven't even talked about what you do in Gaza after the war is over with. Let's say they go in and deliver a hammer blow to Hamas. Hamas is basically crippled to the point where it can't cause much trouble for a good year or two. Let's say that happens. I'm wrong. Right. Then the question is, what are you going to do to make Gaza work? And, you know, people talk about, let's bring in the international community. Nobody in the international community wants any part of that. The Americans don't want to go in there. And really, do the Israelis want to stay there and run the place? I doubt it. We talk about bringing Mahmoud Abbas in. He, of course, is on the West Bank. And Mahmoud Abbas has zero credibility among the Palestinian population. He's an ancient. He's in his late 80s. The idea that he's the solution is laughable, right? So what are the Israelis going to do once this is over with? I certainly don't have a good answer. And I have talked to a good number of people and asked them this very question. And I've not found anybody, including Israeli supporters, who have a good answer.
What is Joe Biden going to do, Professor Mearsheimer? What has this done to his presidency, to the dilemma that he's gotten himself in between, oh, we're wedded at the hip with Israel. Oh, we're in favor of the two-state solution. Oh, we're not in favor of slaughtering innocents. How can he get out of this?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, there's no doubt that Joe Biden is feeling the heat from inside his administration, from inside the White House, inside the State Department, inside USAID. People in his administration are profoundly upset about the killing of Palestinian civilians, and they're putting pressure on him to do something about it. He also understands this has huge consequences for his election next November, because in swing states like Michigan, you have large Arab American communities, and if they're positively hostile toward you, you're likely to lose that swing state and maybe others. So what's happening here is that Biden has a growing incentive to crack down on the Israelis.
Now, I don't know where Donald Trump stands on Ukraine. I don't know where he stands on Israel. He's probably in favor of giving Israel whatever it wants. At one point, he said we wouldn't give Ukraine a nickel. So hooray for him if he believes we shouldn't give Ukraine a nickel. But those candidates last night are in favor of an $875 billion defense budget, Mike, which is larger, as you know, better than I, than the next 12 nations combined, including Great Britain, Russia, and China.
Yeah, and it's ill spent, as we've seen. With the arms that the U.S. has been sending over to Ukraine, they aren't able to actually complete the mission, and part of that has to do with personnel, but a part of it has to do with the fact that weapons are not even adequate. They're not even functional in some cases. So yeah, this is just a complete slush fund for the military-industrial complex, and it's draining the American public. And if the American public had a right to vote on this issue, I guarantee they would vote it down, and they might even vote down funding for an arming of Israel as well, which they should. And I'm the only presidential candidate out there that is opposed to both of these theaters of war, and also the funding of Taiwan in its provocation it's a provocation to China. And effectively, we're trying to patrol the South China Sea, and we're trying to basically, bait China into some sort of a conflict. So all of these are very, very unwitting and very, very dangerous propositions.
Moving back to Israel, does the Netanyahu government consider unarmed women and children to be civilians, or does it consider every human being? This is some crazy rationalization if they do, but do they consider every human being of Palestinian descent or nationality, I guess I should say, in Gaza to be a combatant?
Well, if we take the rhetoric coming out of Likud party and the Knesset and Netanyahu himself, there's a suggestion that they consider every Gazan person to be an enemy who can and should be obliterated. They use the phrase, and not Netanyahu himself, used the biblical term Amalek to refer to the Palestinian peoples. Now, in the Old Testament, there is a sanction, a green light given to the Israelites to utterly destroy Amalek, woman, child, and even pregnant women, basically wipe out the population. So they're using rhetoric like that. And then, of course, their actions are very indicative of the fact that they have no regard for civilian life. They tell people to migrate to the south while they bomb the south. They get to the south and they bomb them there. They're bombing hospitals, ambulances, schools, mosques, churches, etc. They have it's absolutely an indiscriminate campaign of slaughter.
Where do you see the conflagration between Israel and Hamas going in the next 48 hours when the truce is over?
I can see a lot of pressure on Israel to extend the truce coming from Biden, who's terrified of his dwindling political fortunes at home. His base is collapsing over his warm physical embrace of Netanyahu, and the massive amount of military aid, including bunker buster bombs he's delivering to support Israel's exterminationist rampage throughout Gaza. There's pressure coming down on the Israelis from within the talks in Qatar, which are taking place right now. Right. And you'll notice that Tony Blinken's not there. It's Bill Burns, the CIA director. He's really running the show here. Right. And David Barnea, the Mossad chief, is there as well. And they have Hamas on the line. They're talking about releasing more captives. And the question is, when does it reach a point where the rest of the captives become superfluous? And at what point does Netanyahu and his security chiefs, who are responsible for this entire disaster of October 7th on so many levels, and who are being held responsible by the Israeli public, when do they have to go back to war? Because they cannot afford to have this war end without satisfying their maximalist terms of regime change in Gaza, of months and months of warfare, completely changing the regional calculus and restoring what they call deterrence. When does that take place? I don't think it's the next 48 hours, but I think there's enormous pressure internally in Israel for that to take place.
Do you think that the regional actors, from President Erdogan to President al-Sisi to the King of Jordan, will allow the type of extermination that Prime Minister Netanyahu had begun to continue?
Well, Erdogan has used a lot of tough, flamboyant rhetoric. He has, within his AKP base, guys who are actually trying to go to the Syrian border and basically hitch a ride to fight Israel. I mean, he has to satisfy a base that's completely whipped up, and he's doing nothing about it. He's allowing oil and gas to transit through Azerbaijan to Israel. A lot of the fuel that Israel is relying on for its war effort is coming through Turkey. So he's done nothing. What Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has done has been very interesting, because here's someone who came into power basically exterminating the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the first elected government in 5,000 years, which had started to allow things to open up with respect to the Gaza Strip. They're much more sympathetic to Hamas. He has the elected president basically killed in prison. So you would think that he would also agree with Israel's goal of eradicating Hamas. But the one thing he can't allow to have happen is a humanitarian catastrophe that pushes millions of people into the Sinai desert who are desperate refugees in a state that has 80 million people who are already largely, many living below the poverty line. Sisi has said, we will sacrifice millions of lives to prevent our country from being flooded with refugees. So he has blocked what the Biden administration initially called for, which was a, quote, civilian corridor to Egypt, which was crazy, because what it meant was Biden and his people were signing on to the Israeli policy of ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip, which is a goal supported by many Israelis that would be a continuation of the policy that created the Gaza Strip as a walled-in human warehouse that is engaged in armed resistance to end this endless siege and cavalry that Palestinians have experienced.
This is from 2006. You have seen this before, I know. You'll recognize the person immediately, and you'll agree with what he has to say. Cut number 3, Chris.
His new book is called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And President Carter, why did you use the word apartheid in the book's title?
Well, let's look at the entire title, if you don't mind. The first word is Palestine. which involves the land that belongs to the Palestinians, not the Israelis. I didn't refer to Israel because there's no semblance of anything relating to apartheid within the nation of Israel. And I also emphasized the word not, that is peace and not apartheid. That's what I hope to accomplish with this book, is some move toward that goal. But there's no doubt that within the occupied territories, Palestinian land, that there is a horrendous example of apartheid. The occupation of Palestinian land, the confiscation of that land that doesn't belong to Israel, the building of settlements on it, the colonization of that land, and then the connection of those isolated but multiple settlements, more than 200 of them, with each other by highways on which Palestinians can't travel, and quite often where Palestinians cannot even cross. So the persecution of the Palestinians now under the occupying territories is under the occupation forces is one of the worst examples of human rights deprivation that I know.
Jeff, that was 17 years ago, and every word of it is relevant today, is it not? Or was relevant on October 6th when Gaza existed.
It also brings tears to my eyes, to tell you the truth, because what a wonderful human being Jimmy Carter is, and what a remarkable peacemaker he was at Camp David when he brought Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat together, and they made peace between Egypt and Israel and showed how it could be done. And I happened to be in Egypt the following summer, and everywhere I went, and with the peasant farmers, Jimmy Carter, Anwar Sadat, they just loved him for this peacemaking. So he speaks the truth, and he spoke the truth then. This is an apartheid system. Of course it's an apartheid system. It's Israel ruling over occupied territories, and by design, settling hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the occupied territories, something that the UN Security Council repeatedly called Israel to stop, and Israel ignored all of those appeals, and the United States basically backed Israel explicitly or implicitly in all of these recent years. And again, we need a president of the United States who does the job.
Secretary General, currently Ukrainian pilots are trained in Romania to operate and maintain F-16 fighter jets. Is it possible now to outline the time frame for the actual supply of fighter jets to Ukraine, and what factors or obstacles affect this process at this point? Thank you.
Well, I welcome, of course, the decision by NATO allies, Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, to deliver F-16s. I welcome the fact that training of F-16 pilots have already started. And just a few weeks ago, a center for training pilots was established in Romania. I'm not able to give you an exact date, but I hope the delivery can start as soon as possible. The planes are there, but what needs to be done is to train the pilots, and that's ongoing. And the center has been established in Romania, and the United States has also made it clear that NATO allies are allowed to deliver F-16s to Ukraine.
You and Larry and the others and I have argued that the events of October 7 in Israel have burst the myth of Israeli invincibility. What has all of this done to the myth of American invincibility, indispensability, if you will, around the world?
Judge, it's made a very, very small dent.
What do you have? Can you please make a statement about President Joe Biden's speech? This is a clearly warmongering speech. President Joe Biden is calling for $100 billion of funding for Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, and we're supposed to just bundle these together and pretend like we're going to rush to World War III, and we're all just going to let Hillary Rodham Clinton sit here. Okay.
I'm
yes.
sorry. You know,
yes.
this is not this is not the way to have a conversation.
I'm sorry.
If you want to have a conversation, you're welcome to come talk to me afterwards.
You can sit here. Okay, right. You're gonna wait for me, right? Please, I do not believe you.
Listen to you, and I will respond to you.
I do not believe you. Respectfully, I do not believe you. In fact of the matter is that the American people's voice are what need to be heard.
Yeah,
because our president is not speaking for the American people, and neither are you.
That's your opinion. That's your opinion.
Yes, that's my opinion.
Well, then sit down. We've heard your opinion. Thank you very much.
What I have done is I have asked Hillary Rodham Clinton to denounce the president's openly warmongering, suicidal, idiotic speech.
And
that's what I've asked.
Answer. I will
that's
not
what I've done.
So that's the end of our conversation. But I'll still meet you outside.
Need your
but you're done.
Right.
Do you sense, Professor Sachs, that support in Europe for sending military aid to Ukraine is beginning to wane?
It is waning fast. We just had an election in Slovakia this past week where the new government, the candidate that led the party that won the most votes, was campaigning on ending all military support for Ukraine. And that party won a decisive election victory in Poland, which has been the stalwart supporter. They're barely on speaking terms with Ukraine right now because of massive feuds on many fronts. Hungary has long been opposed to the U.S. neocons, and Prime Minister Orban has been very clear-headed, I would say, uniquely so in Europe for a long time. But what's happening in the places that are still strongly supporting Ukraine is that essentially every political leader in Western Europe right now is unpopular. This is amazing. Just like in the United States, President Biden's disapproval ratings are much, much higher than his approval ratings. This is true throughout Europe right now. And this is the sign that people are very unhappy with the way things are going and the direction that's being taken.
Ukraine, where are you on that?
Well, Putin has already lost this war. I watch a lot of the experts.
Putin has lost the war?
He's already lost. My God, this thing was supposed to be wrapped up in a matter of days, if not weeks. This is now deep into the second year. He's lost 200,000 troops. By American terms, that would be as if we lost 400,000. About 20 generals have been either killed on the battlefield or disappeared. He had a quasi insurrection. His economy is in free fall. He's looking for an off-ramp, and in my opinion, we ought to put pressure on both sides to give him one and end this thing.
How is it that NATO and Ukraine itself were so ill prepared for this war?
It was the intelligence failure. They believed their own.
Is that a U.S. intelligence failure,
Yes.
Larry? Your
US
and McGovern's former colleagues?
Yes, a complete intelligence failure.
And I have to throw Jack Devine in there, of course, as well.
Yeah, well, Jack was part of. I worked with Jack back. I was a junior guy, and he was a senior guy on the Contra Wars in Central America. So, Jack is an example of the problem. Instead of stepping back and being able to objectively assess information, they allow partisan feelings to overwhelm that objectivity. And so as a result, you can't step back and say, look, is Russia really this weak? Well, how can you say Russia's weak when it's the #1 country in the world in terms of natural resources and has the mining and industrial capability in place to exploit that? That's not a weak country. And to characterize the Russian military as being weak and inept when the United States itself has not won a war since World War II. We have now. you don't have anybody willing to talk straight and correctly and accurately detail what's going on the ground. I mean, when I watch your conversations with Jack Devine, my head explodes. It's sad because Jack is so out of touch with reality, and yet he keeps insisting that things are true that are simply objectively not true.
Which says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, which is, as we know today, applies to all the government.
Yeah.
The government was doing indirectly what the Constitution prohibits it from doing directly.
Yeah.
It was using private entities to suppress your speech and the speech of millions of others. And thanks to the litigation and a courageous federal judge, they got caught. Let's look at the CIA's cousins in the government, which have created the surveillance state, the secret police who monitor every keystroke on your mobile device and every keystroke on your desktop, who use the power of the government to get private entities like the social media giants to censor speech that they hate. I think you and I are on the same page here, but how would you stop that? I think you could stop the NSA spying on everybody with an executive order. They keep relying on Executive Order 13333, which was signed by Ronald Reagan, which is ambiguous, but they find language in there that lets them spy on everybody, and every president since Reagan has refused to disturb that executive order. Would you stop the mass warrantless surveillance, the suspicionless surveillance of every American?